Seated. Good morning. We are currently in the midst of a sermon series on resurrection, new life. We've heard a little bit about new life for the empty nest, new life for the overscheduled. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention on this particular morning that the Chicago White Sox have started the season atop the AL Central 8-3, and the Cubs are leading the NL Central with a record of 9-2, so new life indeed. Excluding last year, for the Cubs, many of us Cubs fans know all too well what death feels like and what the new life that April can bring, and after last season for the White Sox, I think us White Sox fans are also pretty excited. I think baseball fans have a particular understanding of believing in things we cannot see, things that seem improbable. I think having faith is an important component for a lot of baseball fans. And I think scores of people on the north and south sides of the city are very excited for what the summer and hopefully the fall will bring. I know my father certainly would have been one of those people. He was a very big baseball fan, particularly of our family's Little League teams. On opening day, he would bring a barbecue to the field, and when he had time, he would bring a lawnmower to the field before the game and cross-cut the infield, so it was like we were playing on a big stage. And I remember at his memorial service, one of my sisters even brought a baseball up with her to the lectern as she gave part of her eulogy. And I remember afterwards standing in the reception line, thanking friends and family for attending, and many of them making note of my dad's love of coaching for baseball. Another mentor and long-term friend of mine would have also been excited for the beginning of this season. Ross was a counselor at Camp Highlands for Boys, where I went as a child and worked for several years. He was a math teacher and he was a baseball coach at Evanston Township High School. And unfortunately, several weeks ago, he passed away from stomach cancer at age 40. He is a close friend, someone I've known since I was very young, and one of my best role models. He did much more than just teach me proper stance for hitting and fielding. He taught me how to play the game. He taught me how to play the game with integrity. To show well, but to brag very little. He started experiencing symptoms just this past December, and I'm still struggling with how quickly that all happened. And as I was standing in line at his wake, weighing all the different options for what to say, I had difficulty trying to find the right words. And not that long ago, I myself was in a receiving line, and yet I didn't know how to approach someone on the other side. I think this is something we all struggle with. What do you say to somebody who is deeply grieved, particularly when we are grieved in that same moment? How do I help this person make sense of the new world that they live in? Or at least maybe offer a word of comfort. Or maybe this morning you feel more like Anna and Eli, his wife and son, and you have questions about why something like this happens. And yet we are still here, living on this earth. How do our lives continue to hold meaning? How can we make sense of the world when someone we deeply love passes away? And there are plenty of, let's call them, standard responses that we often sort of give and hear when something like this happens. An example I'm sure many of you have heard or said is God has a plan. And what I believe we mean by this statement is that God is in control. God is going to make sure you wind up all right. God knows more than we do, and there's some greater plan that this death fits into. And yet, I'm not sure we live in a world where God's plan involves taking the lives of our friends and our families. I think I live in a world where God is present with me in my pain, not the cause of it. God's plan does not mean death. God's plan is love and life, despite the pain we feel. Another response we often hear or say is God never gives you more than you can handle. And I think what we mean by this is similar to the first. It implies a sort of plan that God is in control when life seems very out of control. Furthermore, I think we also intend to show that the person has the emotional strength to get through this tough time. We are stating that since God is good, God won't overwhelm you, even in this time. And I think in a small way, we mean to lift up or support the emotional fortitude or toughness of the bereaved. And yet I don't think we live in a world in which God intentionally tests our faith for reasons beyond our understanding. Grief can be overwhelming, and it's not your fault or mine if we feel like we cannot shoulder the burden at times. Because when we say God never gives you more than you can handle, what we are implying is that if you feel like you're drowning, it's not God's fault, but it's yours. Because God wouldn't overwhelm you. But God's plan isn't to push us to our very limits, but to be the wrist or the hand we grab onto when we feel like we're drowning, when we can't swim anymore. God gives us strength, love, and compassion, not obstacles. And God swims beside us as the turbulent waters of life toss us among competing currents and waves. There are two more responses that are common in our understanding that have more similarities than may initially appear. One is the don't cry, don't feel bad, or something of that sort, and the other is it will get better. Both of these responses, I think, are us trying to get at making that person feel better in that moment. Perhaps if they just stop crying, they'll feel better. Perhaps if I remind them of a brighter future, something to look forward to, something to escape to, it'll help them get through the right now. Sometimes we encourage folks to escape, whether it's through looking forward to the future or simply just ignoring the present emotions. And yet I don't think I live in a world where I can't or I shouldn't cry. When a loved one dies, it can be a terrible, crushing feeling, and this is not only normal, but part of a healthy grieving process. It can be brutal, maybe for a short time, or maybe for a long time. But God allows us time to process that death. Maybe that bereaved person's life will get better, or maybe it won't. Maybe it will get worse before it gets better. The future is uncertain, but what is certain is that God is both hurt when we are hurt and with us when we are hurt. With all these pitfalls in our standard responses, maybe we shouldn't say anything at all. After all, silent presence can be a very powerful form of pastoral care. Furthermore, how can what I say in just a couple sentences really affect someone else? So maybe I'll ignore it. Maybe chat with the bereaved about other people in our lives, about our work, about school, about the weather. Cubs' chances at winning the World Series this year. And when we do that, it can come across as a welcome distraction, certainly, or it can come across as avoidance. We avoid talking to our friends and family about these issues for all sorts of reasons. I'm uncomfortable going that deep into my own emotional state, or it reminds me too much of my mortality or the mortality of my loved ones. But I don't believe we live in a world when we are faced with death, the response is silence. We shouldn't be scared to address our deepest fears with those closest to us, and we should be encouraged to share those feelings with our friends and family. God's plan is not for us to bury our emotions, but to share them with confidence, knowing that others have felt or feel just the same as we have and will not judge us for it. Death is a tricky fact of life. What do we say? How do we handle it? What happens to someone after they pass? None of these are easy questions, and most of our answers fall short. When I was a little boy, I asked my father what happened when people die and how heaven works. He grew up Catholic, and he had a rather interesting notion of how heaven worked. He said that all of my ancestors who had passed away were up in heaven looking out for me. He said I had a legion of guardian angels that were personally invested in my safety, and I could talk to them whenever I wanted advice. Every aunt and uncle, great-grandfather and great-grandmother and all who came before them, sitting up in heaven, anxiously watching as their offspring stumble through life, doing whatever they can to protect us, hoping to share some of their wisdom when I or my sisters looked up to the sky with questions. When I was very young, this worldview worked quite well for me, but as I grew up, it seemed less and less believable. That there was a group of past family members that could respond to my prayers as well as intervene in my daily life to keep me from harm, physical or otherwise, seemed unlikely. Throughout my youth and my young adult life, I was fortunate in that no one in my family or friends passed away to test this belief, which I had dropped by my late teenage years. However, all that changed when I graduated from college. My father lost his job, and in January of 2011, he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. The progression of the disease was simultaneously too fast and too slow. It seemed as though once we got into a rhythm for his caregiving, his condition would change. And while it seemed like it was so fast I couldn't keep up, some days and weeks and months felt brutally long. He passed from this earth 2 years ago, this coming August. And so Paul writes, "It is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, and it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body." As humans, we are sown and perishable like a seed, but God raised Jesus and all of us in a way in which we cannot perish. We are raised up from this life in glory, not in shame or dishonor. For many folks, over time, the bad or painful memories of deceased loved ones pass away, and we aren't left with dishonorable memories, but the glorious ones. We live here on earth in our limited, weak, physical bodies, but God gives us so much more than that in God's powerful Spirit. I couldn't tell you if what Paul is saying is factually true. I couldn't tell you if what my father said about guardian angels is factually true. No one knows whether there is an afterlife, and if there is, how it works. Paul here is taking a stab at it, as my father did. I'm not sure what that kind of future looks like. But what I do know is the future that I can control is what I choose to believe about life and death as I live here in this life. What I believe is that I prefer to live in a world where I can still talk to my father, that I can ask him for advice, I can tell him things I'm excited about, that he is up there somewhere smiling down on me and all of us right now. I believe God created a world where there are forces beyond us that are personally invested in our safety, in our happiness, and in the outcome of the world. We live in a world where the resurrection is real. I can't tell you exactly how that works. I can't tell you exactly how death works. But I do know a story, and that story is the Easter story and the resurrection. Jesus Christ's resurrection showed us that death does not have the final say. Despite our human attempts, God turns the story upside down. And the tragic death of the hero is not the end of the story, but the catalyst for the best part. The pain and suffering in the story, and the pain and suffering that many of us experience, is not the way of God and will not conquer love and life. In our story, God loves us so much that God became human to be with us and to feel pain like we do. And then Jesus overcame death so that we don't have to be afraid of it. We are free to live because the threat of death is not the end to our story. We live in a world where the death of a friend or a family member is not the end of that relationship, just a revisioning of what that relationship looks like. As our anthem you will hear shortly says, I will shed the sins and struggles I have carried all these years, and I'll leave my heart wide open. I will love and have no fear. I believe we live in a world where death is not final, and I believe we live in a world where the resurrection can set us free. Thanks be to God.